Hey guys, this is Dr. Ben with Radiant Life Chiropractic, and today we're going to start a series dealing with stress. In this series, we're going to go over what is stress, how does stress affect us, and what we can do to mitigate the effects of stress. This seems pretty appropriate these days with the amount of stress our world has kind of put upon us. So the first thing we should do as we talk about stress is just simply define it. What is stress? And if we look at the National Institute of Mental Health, stress is defined by how the brain and the body respond to any demand. Now, remember that phrasing there, any demand. Typically, when we think about stress, we think about the mental and emotional aspects of stress. We think about anxiety and depression. Those are the most commonly associated issues with stress. But when we look at it from a healthcare perspective, in healthcare, we recognize that it is a pretty big problem and much bigger than just the mental and emotional side. In fact, if we look at the journal JAMA Internal Medicine, in 2013, they released a study that estimated between 60 and 80% of primary care visits were dealing with what's called a primary stress component, meaning that was the main reason that they were there. So we recognize that stress is a big issue. And when we start to look at stress past a mental and emotional side, we then look at all the other types of stress that are put on our body. So we know about those, but then we also have to look at other forms of stress, like metabolic stress. That would be like, blood sugar issues, whether it's your body not processing blood sugar well, like with insulin resistance or diabetes, or on the flip side of that, hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. We look at immune stress with illness, being sick. We look at traumatic stress, which is like a major acute injury. And then we look at exercise and injuries related to exercise, like overtraining, and that's more physical stress. These stressors may be short-term, one-time occurrences, or they may be continuous long-term events, depending on which one it is. Past that, when we look at stress, from a physiological perspective, we break it down into two different types. We have what's called good stress, eustress, and eustress tends to be motivating, tends to be focusing. It increases performance. It improves well-being. So these are things like job promotion, marriage, having children, and the effects on the body tend to raise your body temperature, enhances or improves cognition and mental focus. It helps to regulate blood pressure in a good way, and stimulates skeletal muscle and focuses energy. Now, on the flip side of that, we have bad stress, or distress as it's termed, which can create anxiety. It can decrease performance. It can be distracting, and it creates a scenario where it appears outside of our own coping abilities. Now, this would typically be things like losing a loved one or a friend, becoming unemployed, having financial troubles, sleep issues, injury, illness, those type of things. And the effects seem a little different with this type of stress. So with distress, you tend to diminish memory and cognition, weaken immune function, we raise blood pressure, it can cause weight gain, and it can create poor glucose regulation. So as we look at the two different types of stress, we then have to look at what we do with stress. Meaning we know that we have lots of stress on our body and our brain. We're constantly being berated with stress. That's not going to change for most people. You can't eliminate all of your stress. You might be able to eliminate some of it, but you can't eliminate all of it. So then we have to look at how well the body adapts to stress, how well the brain adapts to stress. And that's more of the key component. And there was a medical doctor who was named Hans Selye back in around 1950. He's considered the father of stress. He created what's called the general adaptation syndrome, which basically looks at the ability of the human body to adjust to stress, good and bad. And then within that, we look at creating the appropriate metabolic and cognitive response to stress. And that general adaptation syndrome should begin and end with each stress cue. So each stressor, each stress that we perceive, gets its own stress response. And there's 3 general stages to the general adaptation syndrome. There's what's called alarm, so that's the initial response to stress. Then resistance, how well you handle said stress. And depending on how long that stress continues to occur, or how many of those stressors you encounter at one time, you can hit exhaustion. And at the end of the day, really adaptation is what matters. We can, again, deal with a lot of stress coming in. Our brain, our body is very, very good at that, under the right conditions, handling either a lot of small stressors or one large stressor, until it's not. And what we don't want to create is a scenario where our nervous system and our body starts to either treat every little stress as a major stress, taking a nuclear approach to stress, or just losing adaptation altogether. Now, when we look at loss of adaptation, there's some pretty interesting things that pop up. Several journals, including like the Journal of Molecular Science, the Journal of Internal Medicine, Journal of Psychiatry, they've all found that losing adaptation to stress can lead or be associated with several health conditions, including things like infertility, cardiovascular disease, depression, diabetes. Well, those all make sense. And those are some of the more common things that people deal with, especially in the United States. So, being able to accurately and readily adapt to stress would be ideal. We don't want to create an exaggerated response. And that is what we will start with next time in our second video on stress. How does stress happen physiologically, and how that integrates with our metabolism? But we will cover that in the next video. Thank you guys for listening to this first one, and I'll see you next time.